Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and I hope you're having a marvelous day. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your thumbs up, for your comments, and thank you for sharing the videos. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. Well, they finally got this heifer arrested for what she did to the Nigerian immigrant with jungle fever. After so many months, it started to look like she wasn't going to have to answer to what she'd done. But they finally got her arrested. And now the hard work begins of getting her convicted, because that's going to be a challenge too, because the entire relationship is going to come under scrutiny. But my question is, do all black people need self-love therapy? Because this was as toxic a relationship as we've ever seen. And we all know that the first sign of problems is usually not taking somebody's life. Usually it's a build-up over time, and a person reaches a point where they decide that this is the way I'm going to handle it. So the question would be, how much do you take before you realize it's time to go? This man was an African immigrant, and they boast about their pride in their culture, their tribe, their language, and you would just have thought that he would have had more pride or more self-awareness than to stay in a toxic relationship with a person like this. So the question becomes self-love and self-respect. How much latitude do you give another person that you are intimately involved with? How far do you go? Where is the line, and when do you draw it? With African Americans, we hear about post-traumatic slave syndrome, and we still suffer to some degree from the after effects of slavery, because it's still with us. When we talk about education, when we talk about employment, when we talk about health, when we talk about business, being able to navigate the society, we still feel the after effects of slavery and how the society was set up from the beginning. So yes, African Americans suffer from some degree of post-traumatic slave syndrome, and obviously some of us suffer more than others. So we talk about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. We look at the gender disparities between black men and black women, and the animosity sometimes that arise from those disparities. So we acknowledge that we have something carrying over from the slavery days that we haven't worked out. Apparently, the Africans are struggling with self-love too. Colonization, which is the first cousin of slavery, took over the African continent. I think all but 2 countries were colonized. And that was brutal. It was long-lasting, and it did damage to them as well. So we are all suffering from some kind of trauma, and that trauma has caused us to turn on ourselves. And it is the most destructive thing that African people, African descended people, can do to themselves and to each other. The trauma that was caused by slavery and colonization, the destruction of civilizations, all of that stuff has caused black people, and I'm calling all African people black people. It has caused us to turn on ourselves and each other, and that's what we call self-hatred. So, do all black people need self-love therapy? And if we do, how would we begin the treatment? What would we do to start loving ourselves? How do you begin to overcome the propaganda, the indoctrination, the brainwashing of somebody telling you over and over again, year after year after year, for hundreds of years, that they're better than you, they're smarter than you, they've made all of the advances and contributions in the world, and you've made nothing, and on top of that, they look better than you? How do you begin to overcome that when somebody is in a more powerful position than you are? How do you hear that for hundreds of years without believing it? So the $64,000 question is, how do you overcome that? Because overcoming that indoctrination, that brainwashing, would be the beginning of self-love and self-respect. Now I could go and do some research and tell you what the psychologists say, what the sociologists say, what the police say, what the preachers say. But what common sense tells me is the beginning of self-love is accepting yourself as you are, flaws and all, and knowing when to draw the line with other people. Narcissism, being controlling, and thinking you're better than everybody else are not signs of self-love or self-respect. Narcissism is a personality disorder. Being a controlling person or thinking you're better than everybody else are signs of insecurity. That is not self-love. So I'm going to wrap this video up with 2 trending topics that indicate black men in particular not having enough self-love. The first one is this Toby Obumseli case, in which he stayed in a toxic and abusive relationship way too long. Nobody knows why this man stayed in that relationship. Nobody knows why he did not think more highly of himself and his family, because this right here, his family publicly grieving over what had happened to him, should have been an incentive, if nothing else, for him not to get caught up in a situation so deep that a person would do something to him that would leave his family in this kind of grief. So even if you don't love yourself, you ought to love your family members, because if something like this happens to you, it's going to devastate your family. The second thing is this white woman publicly coming out and telling black men that the reason I'm with you is because my white skin gives me power over you. And I like my biracial sons better than I do daughters, because that gives me access to the patriarchy of black men, and that equals control. Now that statement alone should be a wake-up call for black men who are running around here bragging about their access to white women and trying to weaponize that against black women. When a person comes out and says something like that, she's saying, I don't have any respect for you. There is no other way to interpret that. I've heard black men play that video and go back and try to explain it and re-explain it and translate it another way, but it speaks for itself. She said, my white skin gives me power over black men. So how do we get to self-love? I think the first thing you have to do is recognize that we've been brainwashed. We've been bamboozled. We've been hoodwinked, to quote Malcolm X. We've had somebody else's view of ourselves shoved down our throats, and we fell for it. We fell for the okie doke. So the first step to self-love is recognizing that we have been brainwashed, and then we have to do the work of finding ways to love ourselves. Somebody said that if you look in the mirror and don't like what you see, you need to stand there until you like what you see. So that's the first step. And then I think some of it will come naturally. You know where the line is. You know when people have gone too far with you. When you're dealing with people and you see they don't respect your space, they don't respect you, putting hands on you, using abusive and offensive language with you, step away. You simply step away. There's nothing like leaving a person alone to get a message across. And then if all else fails, see a therapist and say, you know what, I just don't love myself and I don't love people who look like me. Just be honest. Somebody will be able to help you. But I think most of us can do this work ourselves because we know we've been bamboozled. We know that. Going hand in hand with self-love is self-respect. When you respect yourself, you set boundaries for yourself and for other people dealing with you. And I suspect that that's what this young man did not do. He did not set boundaries for himself. And then she crossed boundaries with him. You have to have your own boundary set and say, this is the line. You don't cross that line with me. I believe that all black people are suffering from the things that have happened to us for the last 400 or 500 years. And yes, our DNA carries the message of the trauma that our family members, our ancestors suffered hundreds of years ago. It goes generation to generation. And the last thing I'm going to say is it is a mistake for black people in particular to think that anybody else can solve our problems or that anybody else is the answer to whatever is wrong with us. You can't be in a system where somebody has oppressed you for 400 years and think those people are the answer to your problem. They're not. You have to be the answer to your problems. And black people have to stop this dependence on other people, running to other races of people because they're so much better than you, and there's so much this and there's so much that than you, and then that ends up being your destruction. Now, Toby Obumseli was guilty of this. I'm not sure that he said that about his people and his tribe, but he definitely said these things about African Americans. Nobody has any instance where any African American had done anything to him, but he had already generated some kind of a hatred against African Americans, people who looked like him. So really, that's indicative of self-hatred. And he bonded with somebody who was the opposite of who he was. When you think somebody else is better, somebody else is the answer, and that your people are your enemy, your own people who look like you are your enemy. When you start thinking like that, you're on the road to self-hatred, and self-hatred leads to self-destruction. We have to learn to love ourselves. Okay, everybody, let me know what you think about this. Subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video, and as always, have a great day.